Well, good evening. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our regulars on these AJA Zoom events, and welcome to any new people that might be joining us for the first time this week. As well as to those watching on Facebook, we want to welcome also people listening on J-Air, where we are now streaming these Australian Jewish Association Zoom sessions. So you'll be listening on 88 FM in Melbourne or via the website j-air.com.au. My name is Alan Friedman. I'm Vice President of the Australian Jewish Association, and also visible on your screens are David Adler, President of the AJA, as well as our guest for tonight, Gerald Steinberg, who we will formally introduce in a moment. This week will be our presentation format, where Gerald will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, after which we will open up for questions from the audience. And if you're not sure what that means, you can ask a question by electronically raising your hand. That's if you're watching via Zoom. The way to raise a hand electronically is to click the reaction icon at the bottom and you'll see a little hand. If you click on that, we get a signal and then you go into the queue for questions. Written questions can be placed on the chat function, and Robert Gregory, our Public Affairs Officer, will read out some of those in between the spoken ones. Okay, so non-governmental organisations, or NGOs, are generally defined as non-profit entities that are independent of government influence. And there are hundreds of them around the world, and it seems that a high percentage of them are hostile to Israel. So the Jewish world is fortunate indeed that 20 years ago, Gerald Steinberg founded NGO Monitor to ensure that decision makers around the world and in civil society operate in accordance with the principles of accountability, transparency, and universal human rights. And with a long list of victories to his credit, or to its credit, NGO Monitor has been calling out bad behaviour ever since. And of greater concern is that there are also several Jewish NGOs that sadly fall into that category, and in effect supporting the Arab and Muslim war against Israel. That list includes the New Israel Fund, J Street, Breaking the Silence, and others, which don't seem to have a problem supporting Israel's enemies. To give us some background on these organisations, we're delighted to have Professor Gerald Steinberg with us tonight. Gerald, welcome to Australia and our AGA Zoom event, and thank you for your time.
Alan, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And it's a pleasure to meet all of you, or at least to be able to see all of you on screen, and you fill up the screen quite well, I have to say. You've already, Alan, used your introduction makes my job a lot easier because you've explained a lot of what I do and what my organization does. I should say that there are about 20 people now at NGO Monitor. It's not a one-man show. I did start it, sometimes I say it's one of the biggest mistakes of my life 20 years ago, but I thought I would be able to write a few articles, maybe a book about the NGO war against Israel. And it turned out to be a lot more complicated and it'd take a lot more of my time. So here I am 20 years later, and we're still going strong in terms of even uncovering all the different layers. It's like an archaeological dig. I'm going to put on a set of slides to take you through some of the details of this. I'll start with the big picture, the NGO, what I call an NGO industry, and the main aspects of that industry, and then I'll go specifically to some of the different frameworks, including, as Alan mentioned, the Jewish-Israeli element of that or dimension of that industry. So with your permission, I will now move on to screen sharing. No, I think I want, this is the one I want. Okay, share. And there you have it. That is the beginning. Give you an introduction. That this is I think the term, calling it an NGO war in academic terms, sometimes it's called soft power conflict, hard power being things that go bang and boom, bombs and bullets, as we used to call them or still call them. NGOs and the propaganda war, that's another term that's used to demonize, in this particular case, in many cases, Israel. It's very much more pronounced in attacking Israel than in almost any other conflict or instance in the world. These organizations, as I will describe throughout this talk, have focused a great deal of their resources, a very disproportionate, obsessive amount of their resources in targeting Israel. Now, some of them are Israeli and Palestinian, and that certainly plays a significant role. But as I'll explain, they get most of their funding from foreign governments, primarily Europe, a little bit from Australia. Just because I'm talking to you and you're Australians, I won't leave Australia out, but Australia has been much more careful in its funding. A few mistakes, I will call them mistakes, they may call them different perspectives, but it's mainly European funding that get, plus a lot of private funding. And you have organizations that spend, literally have budgets of hundreds of millions of dollars, US, Australia, when you get to those numbers, doesn't make a difference what currency it is, and much of that money very disproportionately goes to attacking Israel. So I want to describe all of this and then talk about the specific aspects and a little bit about perhaps what can be done about it. Just to explain a little bit about what we're talking about here, non-governmental sometimes I give a talk and after an hour somebody says to me, what's an NGO? So I thought I would at least present the information. Non-governmental organizations, in some ways that's a fictitious term because a lot of them get their money from governments, but this concept of having a non-governmental organization or a civil society organization, not just one, but to have them deeply embedded in governments began, one can certainly trace back to the post-World War II period, a rebuilding of Europe, where in places like in Germany and Italy, where you had the Nazi regime, fascist regimes, it was important to have some sorts of checks and balances on the government. And so the West, the United States, the UK, others supported the concept of building non-governmental organizations. And that was 70 years ago. Now they are a very powerful industry. This is one of those examples of no good deed goes unpunished. And as I said, some of them certainly don't qualify as non-governmental. Their budgets are very large. Often I hear this from my friends and colleagues in the Israeli Foreign Ministry, but elsewhere, that the budgets of some of these NGOs, just to give you an idea, Amnesty International is close to 400 million pounds a year. Human Rights Watch is close to 100 million US dollars a year. And when you add it all up, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry every year. So it's the amount of money they have to spend on their activities is significant, and money gets interpreted to political power. But a main aspect of this is that there are no checks and balances. These are wonderful people you'll all often hear. These are warriors for human rights. These are people who've devoted their lives, they very much in an altruistic way. And we don't need to, the idea of monitoring what they do and making sure they don't divert their activities, their funds to things which are the opposite of what they claim to do. You don't have to do that. Journalists will always cut and paste directly, copy from some of their best friends. Between journalists and NGOs go both ways. So there's very little oversight. They have special status in the United Nations. Sometimes the term is ECHO, Economic and Social Council status, which allows NGOs, over 5,000 of them, to participate in the discussions, debates, not to vote, but in every other way to influence the Human Rights Council in particular, but other UN bodies as well. I will confess that for reasons which we still don't quite understand, NGO Monitor applied. We thought we would be documenting the process, and we ended up being accepted into this group, and we use that role to participate in Human Rights Council debates and discussions. But it's a ratio of about 1,000 to 1. There are 4 or 5 NGOs that are not anti-Israel. Another one you may know about is UN Watch, B'nai B'rith International. It has that, and European Union of Jewish Students. But it's really most of the NGOs that function in the UN and have a very major influence are NGOs that are part of this. We now use the term progressive NGO power group or network that generally has very similar anti-Western, what are called post-colonial political ideas, and that is influences throughout the United Nations system, and in many cases in parliaments and in the media. And the last aspect is the growth of anti-Semitism, of this obsessive focus on Israel, which you can trace back to the 1970s, to the Zionism is Racism resolution which was adopted by the UN General Assembly, largely through the support of the Soviet bloc and the Arab League and the Islamic countries. And that got amplified and has continued since then. And that's how the NGOs then fit into that. Back in the 70s, the NGOs played a minimal role. They were small. They didn't have these kind of budgets or influence. And now that they have become part of the system and adopted the anti-Semitic, anti-Israel positions, it has a lot of influence, and I'll be documenting that as I go along. Just a couple words about our own organization. As I said, it was founded about 20 years ago. There was something called the Durban Conference in the United Nations, which was the coming out of what was called the NGO Forum, then 1,500 organizations. That's when I decided these have to be examined. They adopted this anti-Israel, not just resolution, but working plan, which has led to BDS and all the other phenomena we see now. We have about 20 employees, but we're a research group. We're not a political activist group. We have a database. I have to update the slide because I think we're close to 250 organizations that we focus on, primarily groups that are active in the Israeli-Palestinian arena. There's a lot more work to be done on these NGOs as political actors in environment and other things. We leave that to other people. Our job is to provide the information and analysis, and particularly to promote the accountability that the NGO community and its supporters generally don't do, and to provide this checks and balances that I said was largely missing. To look at the big picture, we're talking about an industry, and I'll use that term, or in this case, an anti-industry, which has roughly about $100 million US annually just targeting Israel. And I said there's a lot of money going into this. It's the enormousness, the enormity of the size of all this activity. That's why you can barely pick up a newspaper. Do people still pick up newspapers, or at least look at Facebook and Twitter and WhatsApp and whatever else, and watch on videos? The news in any form, you're almost not going to have a day go by without some attack on Israel being led by one of these organizations. They have a huge amount of money, which means they have a huge amount of influence. They can get their allegations, their accusations, what they call reports, all of that into the mass media, just because they have a lot of money and a lot of people who work this. Most of these organizations have a third to a half of the people working for them devoted to public relations. Some of that is getting money, donors, but some of that is just getting their political views, what they call their reports, out into the public sphere, and to have a major influence. The 100 million comes mainly from governments. That doesn't include the amount of money that comes from the Rockefeller brothers in the US, Open Society Foundation, which is George Soros and others. They are major funders of groups like Human Rights Watch, which are not part of the governmental framework. So in that context, I've divided up this big industry into three basic groups. There are global NGOs, superpowers, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. If anybody follows what goes on in French, there's a similar group to Amnesty called the International Federation of Human Rights, which is based in Paris, which also has an international presence, functions in dozens of countries. And all of these repeat the same messages over and over again. So the first layer is the global group. Then there is a significant number of Palestinian NGOs, very active. Some of you may have heard about the details, and I'll mention that briefly later on, that the most influential, the ones that have the largest amount of money and influence and visibility, are very closely linked to and in some ways directly controlled by, or set up by, a terrorist organization, the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine. And you may know the Israeli government a few weeks ago designated 6 of these organizations. There was an earlier one, so now 7, as being fronts for the PFLP. And at the same time, they are considered to be human rights organizations. They have access to the UN. They are frequently quoted in the media. Some of them will appear even in Canberra, in front of the Canadian Parliament, to present what they call their evidence of Israeli war crimes or apartheid or whatever the particular allegation of the time is. And the third layer, and I know that's the one that many of you are interested in, and I'll talk about how the pieces fit together, are the Israeli NGOs, almost all of which, in terms of the significance and visibility, are part of the network which was created by the New Israel Fund. and very much operates in that same framework. So those are the three layers or three different aspects of the global attacks or the NGO attacks on Israel: the global groups, the Palestinian groups, and the Israeli groups. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the details of these organizations. And just very quickly, just what do? They are the ones who lead these campaigns against Israel. BDS, for instance. There would not be, in my view, a significant BDS movement. You wouldn't hear about it in Australia. It wouldn't be part of the campus life of having every other week some university campus adopting a resolution to boycott Israel. If it wasn't for the NGOs, this would barely exist. It was initiated at the NGO Forum of the Durban Conference in 2001, and all the organizations that I've talked about and will talk about are involved in promoting this. Don't buy Israeli products. Don't have any links with Israeli academics. If Israeli sports groups or artists come to your country, lead demonstrations, try to prevent them from being allowed to perform. That is very much involved at the NGO movement, and you see very much their activism in promoting this campaign. Sometimes there's this myth that says that the BDS movement was founded by a Palestinian by the name of Omar Barghouti in 2004, 2005. He was added to have a Palestinian face to what is essentially a Western NGO-led anti-Israel and anti-Semitic campaign that, as I said, was launched around 2001. And it's based on the South African, this is what we did to defeat South African apartheid. We're going to now apply this to Israel. And everything that I have here that we've seen is really cutting and pasting copied from the anti-apartheid movement. The second dimension is the lawfare aspects. Israel is a country of war criminals. Israel is a country that commits that not just commits, that is inherently an apartheid state. They come up with these reports with lots of legal sounding language. I don't know if they're lawyers or people who know about international law, academics on this, but we have people who have dissected and taken apart. It's all fictitious, it's all made up. But if you wave your hands enough and say the right words, then journalists pick up your language. It gets repeated over and over again, and all of a sudden it becomes part of the buzz. And it becomes the buzz whether it's in universities or in allegations that are raised in the International Criminal Court or in the resolutions of the UN Human Rights Council, which are then picked up and quoted to justify BDS campaigns. So that's what a lot of what these NGOs do. Those are the two main fronts of the propaganda war. I want to spend a few minutes talking about the Palestinian groups and then about the Israeli groups and about how they work together. Among the Palestinian groups that are prominent, what we see, first of all, as in the case of Israeli groups, most of their funding comes from European governments. Western European governments for the last 20 years, almost automatically, maybe automatically because the processes are hidden, gives to exactly the same organizations year after year after year. And we've tracked that in great detail. Each one of these organizations gets money from the European benefactors. While we don't have all of the years, in some cases it's 10 years, 11 years, some years in some cases it's less. Each country, if you look, you see that each of these countries provides to the same organization. It's a network. It's not that they have what they claim to have, call for proposals. We're going to support human rights. Send us your proposals. We'll evaluate the proposals and we'll decide who we're going to give money to according to the quality of the proposals and the organizations. That's a big fiction, because the same organizations get money year after year. And the same people who head these organizations meet with European diplomats and officials and politicians and journalists and academics year after year after year. And this is where we are actually praise and are happy to have tools like Twitter and Facebook, because we can see these interactions. We can see them as they're taking place and show how close the organizations are. So if these are non-governmental organizations, but their main funding comes from European governments year after year after year, and it's a small group, the same 10, 12 organizations get money every year, then that's no longer fits the definition of NGOs or civil society. It's a facade. These are I call them political subcontractors that work on behalf of the European governments to promote a weakening of Israel. And I can go into how this, it also goes back 20 years, almost 20 years, some cases longer, why the Europeans start off on this direction and don't even question the damage or the impact or the process. And there's no other country or conflict in the world where you have this phenomenon. This is something unique to Israel. Of these organizations, the ones that get the most money and are the most closely linked to the Europeans are closely linked to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. NGO Monitor, in its research, based on open sources, I'll show you some examples in a minute, has identified 13 Palestinian NGOs, the ones that get most of the money and have been getting it almost every year for 20 years, maybe every year because we don't have all the information, or either they have, or maybe I should say both, they have a number of officials, very often the financial officials or board members, who wear two hats. One hat is they hold positions in an organization called Defense for Children International Palestine, which, by the way, has been active in Canberra and has its supporters also among members of the parliament, the Australian parliament. DCIP campaigns on Israel commits war crimes and does terrible things to Palestinian children. If you try, by the way, to verify any of their claims, you can't do it because they claim to have secret affidavits. It's all hand waving. They're a propaganda organization, but if you look at the names of these people, you see a number of them also have positions in the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And you go through this list, there's 6 groups that the Israeli Defense Ministry finally in October designated officially as PFLP fronts, terror fronts. The earlier one back in May was the health worker committees. And these organizations, as the Ministry of Defense has declared, are operated by and for the benefit of the PFLP, designated as a terrorist organization by the US, EU, Canada, and Israel, and I believe also Australia, although the definition is a little bit unclear. What's most important is that they also take the money they get from the Europeans and feed it into the terror network. Europeans say we don't see any evidence of that, but slowly they're cutting off the funds. I think that they just don't want to have the embarrassment of having been caught out. They do it, as I said, through transferring money. $200 million of European funding from these organizations in the last 10 years, under the banners of human rights and international aid, have been siphoned off for paying for the pay for slay is what they call it, given money to the martyrs, terrorists, and their families. For some of it's been siphoned off according to Israeli indictments in courts and convictions for taking money, and if that was designated for human rights or for agricultural development and other things, and sending it straight to terrorist organization in order to recruit terrorists, to pay for their salaries, all these things for propaganda, that's all part of the process. When I say that they go to university campuses, they send speakers, they provide films, they provide all sorts of other propaganda, and this is where the money comes from. Just to be very specific about this, because there's a campaign to say there's no evidence, and therefore Israel is just trying to prevent these wonderful organizations from criticizing Israeli government policy. This is the information that NGO Monitor found by doing research. We didn't find it accidentally, by researching carefully each one of these organizations and who the people are. It's amazing and depressing to me that you have governments funding them with millions and millions of euros and dollars and krona and pounds every year, and apparently nobody's ever bothered to look or didn't care about the terror links. These are people from the different organizations here. There are 4 different organizations represented in this one example that were arrested. Some of them are on trial, some have been convicted for being involved in different ways in a terrorist cell, a PFLP terrorist cell, which they themselves have acknowledged, that killed a 17-year-old Israeli woman by the name of Rina Shnerb in August 2019. So people who say, well, the PFLP is just a political organization, or these are just members of the political wing and not terrorists, that's all fiction. These 5 individuals who are, as I said, were arrested, indicted, and in some cases convicted, have had different roles in each of these, non-governmental organizations, whether it's for human rights or agricultural workers. Each one of these groups defines itself or health workers in different ways. So the links between these 2 frameworks are very, very tight. I mentioned DCIP, just a quick example that you can find on the internet, individuals, people who speak Arabic, and those are the people that we employ, who have found the same person, both listed, showing up in a poster or event held by the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine and this DCIP group. So the overlapping memberships are quite clear. They do not require anybody to have secret information from the Israeli intelligence services. They're right out there, in this case, mostly on Facebook. Here's another set of examples. The Agricultural Workers Committee, which the Australian government did fund for a number of years, ostensibly because they do develop Palestinian agriculture. They also promote very strongly lawfare and BDS, war crimes, all of that. And they also have these close ties to the terrorist framework. The commander of the cell that killed Rina Schneerb was for a number of years the accountant for, or the financial director of the group called the Union of Agricultural Workers Committee, which is one of the PFLP organizations. So this is an extensive network, and that's the point, which has ties to terrorism. There's the 4th one, another group, another example. It just reinforces the same point, so I won't go into details. When the Israeli government, the Ministry of Defense, declared these organizations to be terrorist organizations, terrorist fronts, we got this huge wave from the NGO community claiming this was all invented and fictitious, that it was designed to prevent these wonderful human rights organizations from criticizing Israel. And in this context, I need to move this bar out of the way here. We have articles from all sorts of different places in the media. I did see some of the Australian media as well. But basically, it's the same thing. New York Times, Israel moves to silence the stalwarts of Palestinian civil society. All the language is there. And because I want to now talk about the Israeli NGOs and the New Israel Fund Network in particular, I'll give you this one quote. There's from an exchange that I had in a British publication called Fathom on this terrorist designation. And here the head of NIF UK said, this designation is not about terrorist activity. It is instead about political activity that the Israeli government doesn't like. After failing to convince allies, it finally took a unilateral decision to shut the activity down. The labeling of human rights and civil society organizations that protect and provide for vulnerable and marginalized people as terrorists means the Israeli government is seeking to suppress several pillars of Palestinian civil society. This is not a Palestinian spokesperson. This is the head of the New Israel Fund in the UK in a quite prominent online publication called Fathom, in response to what I wrote. I then wrote a response saying, you don't even mention Rina Schneerb, you don't mention the very visible evidence, and they chose not even to respond to that. So it shows you, I think, how closely connected these different levels of organizations are in this broad NGO network. So I'm now going to move to the broader discussion of the Israeli political NGO network. That's the 3rd pillar of all of these. And I'm going to start because, oops, I have to go back one. I know that there's interest in the New Israel Fund, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the background and history. How am I doing on time? I think I have a good 10 minutes left, right? I'll try to make it short. I think it's important to understand the background. What is the New Israel Fund? It was founded in 1979, largely by Israeli and American Jewish supporters of the Labor Party, which for the first time in the history of Israel and the history of the Zionist movement since the 1920s, was voted out of power. In essence, the New Israel Fund began and in many ways still is or considers itself to be a government in exile. Not elected by anybody, not having any form of checks and balances, no democratic processes, but what they, I would say, promote is a different approach, a different set of policies, an opposition outside of Israel. It's funded outside of Israel in order to change Israeli policies to policies that they promote. It's important to note that they have no legal standing or presence in Israel. This organization, which has a budget of about, I think I'll show it in the next slide, about $31 million a year, it's not a small amount at all, and which uses its funds to support a number of Israeli organizations, including ones that are very involved in opposition politics, has no legal presence in Israel. Therefore, no oversight, no regulation, nothing. Their main activities are through a network of Israeli NGOs. Just as a side point, they also have branches, as you know, in Australia, also the UK, Germany, Switzerland, and Canada. But the policies are largely determined, and the main source of funding is from the United States. I know Australia, NIF, has its own programming, raises its own funding, but I still see it in the work that we've seen as it's very much a single organization where the United States group is dominant. What's most important, or what is also important is that the process by which they decide who to fund, what policies to make, are secret. This is an organization that says it promotes progressive, democratic, open values, morality, ethics, and yet its entire decision-making process is highly secretive. And I've spoken to a number of donors who have said they have no idea why one organization gets funding and another organization doesn't, or how their funds are actually used. And in some cases, some donors, having been exposed to some of the details of what's being done, have left the organization. So there's some serious issues that need to be raised in a broader sense with the NIF network. I said 31 million, I stand corrected. My memory is goes back a few years. They were up. The last annual budget that they published was from 2019. I think we'll get the 2020 numbers pretty soon, but it was listed as 35 million US dollars, of which half goes to a group of 273 Israeli NGO affiliates. That's a big network. They operate, through their support, I was going to say their funding, but in a minute I'll explain why that's not exactly accurate. They have a lot of connections to different organizations. Some of these are 1 and 2 people organizations. Some of them involve dozens of people and have much higher visibility. NGO Monitor focuses on the 32 organizations within this network that have the greatest visibility impact in the issues of Israeli policies, the demonization, the soft power warfare, and the propaganda that BDS or boycotts in different forms and in lawfare. So some people think of the NIF as all its money going to this type of warfare. We're talking about 10%, but that has a lot of impact. And the headings that they use are human rights and democracy. These are all part of the progressive liberal agenda. And they all are part of the altruistic and normative democracy-based process, which they claim to promote. So you see here religious freedom, social and economic justice, Palestinian citizens of Israel. Notice they call them Palestinian citizens of Israel, not Israeli Arabs. It's a semantic and political debate, which is very loaded. New initiatives for democracy. Here again, we're seeing them claiming to play a role, a very strong role, they say, in Israeli democracy. And yet the organization itself doesn't follow the same principles. Also shared society and combating racism. Portraying Israel as a racist society as a constant theme, which requires external intervention, which they happen to provide. One of the points that I want to make, which very few people realize until they look at the details, is that Most of the money that these NGOs have actually comes from European governments. Almost all of these 32 groups, maybe all, get the majority of their funding from European governments. In some cases, a few cases, they get all of their funding from European governments. In other cases, they get 90% of their funding from European governments. The NIF provides seed money, they provide coordination, they provide assistance in making the contacts with the Europeans who will gladly provide this extra funding. Very often you'll see the head of one NIF group moving to another NIF group or setting up his own NIF group or her own NIF group. And they go to the same European governments and they just pick up where they were before. It's important to see this as a network and a very successful network. I'm not going to expect anybody to go through all this whole table. It's a table that's I've been in the process of publishing, but this is just a list of those organizations and where their money comes from. And primarily you get the total budgets in New Israel shekels. And you see in many cases, we're talking about millions of shekels over a period of, this is a period of 3 years, because very often the grants are in for more than 1 year. So here we have B'Tselem, which gets about half of its funding from European governments and about 12 to 13 million shekels. And I've forgotten what the exchange rate is in Australian money, but it's about 3 to 1 in US dollars. So this is a significant amount of money which they use to buy influence. That's why we see their names constantly. B'Tselem, Breaking the Silence, these are in multi-million shekel amounts where a large part of their money comes from European governments. Here we have the Human Rights Defenders Fund, which is a smaller organization. It does exactly the same thing. Everybody that every terrorist or every person that's accused of violating the law in some way and is associated with these propaganda campaigns is defined by them as human rights defenders, and they then do campaigns on their behalf. It's almost entirely funded by European governments, and it is part of the NIF network. Who Profits, which for many years ran the BDS campaign, you see is also part of that same network. They are the ones that identified the targets for boycotts around the world, different companies, different services. So I won't go through each one of these, but it's important for me to show how closely these are integrated into the European political process. They are subcontractors for European governments, and they play that role. Just to give you a few examples, I keep going too fast here, a few examples of where these organizations fit in the big picture. The NIF likes to say very often that their guidelines say they will not fund organizations that participate in partisan political activity, advocate human rights selectively for one group over another, employ racist derogatory language, or work to deny the right of the Jewish people to sovereign self-determination within Israel. Many of these organizations violate what they call these guidelines on an almost continuous basis. The other part of their guidelines talks about not funding global BDS activities against Israel or support organizations that have global BDS programs. But then they say it will not exclude support for organizations that lawfully discourage the purchase of goods or use of services and settlements. The ambiguity of these phrases basically means that many of the organizations are very active in BDS. Global BDS, they'll say, no, this wasn't global BDS. It's only about buying products and settlements. Well, if you look at what these organizations do, you will almost always see that there's absolutely no distinction. It constantly is talking about the need to boycott Israel, to punish Israel, supporting United Nations Human Rights Council blacklists, which is strictly BDS. Almost all the groups in there are Israeli organizations that provide services to Israelis and Palestinians over the Green Line, over the 1949 armistice lines. And when these groups say call for boycotting them, these companies, then what they're really doing is doing global BDS. But of course, the NIF says, no, that's against our guideline. They don't do that. It's a complete denial. The NIF also says it firmly opposes attempts to prosecute Israeli officials in foreign courts. But in fact, these organizations are extremely active in the campaign directed at the International Criminal Court to investigate now an ongoing investigation of Israelis under the allegation of committing war crimes or apartheid. So you see in many of their press releases, in their statements in the UN sessions and elsewhere, you'll see very often, just a minute here, I have to turn this off. You'll see that these organizations are closely involved. I'll just give you a couple of examples. I could fill tons of screens in time, which I won't do, with many more examples. Here's an example of an organization, Kerem Navot, another NIF group, that work closely with Human Rights Watch, which is the global organization most obsessively anti-Israel in a really deeply hostile way and a consistent way. And they published a joint report, and the language is in itself significant. Bed and breakfast on stolen lands. You can feel the poison in this. Tourist rental listings in the West Bank settlements. What this was a BDS campaign, which they sought, and they succeeded for a short period of time, in forcing Airbnb, through threats of boycotts and other things, to join the BDS movement. A few weeks later, Airbnb realized they'd made a mistake, and they pulled out of this. But my point is, this was involved a significant part of the NIF network. The organizations that join in UN anti-Israel, blatantly anti-Israel campaigns, like the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People. Most people don't even know this committee exists. It was created in 1975 in parallel to the Zionism is Racism resolution. That resolution was rescinded, but the committee continues to function. And these NGOs, again, these are NIF NGOs, Israeli NGOs, which give legitimacy because they say, we're Israeli, we're Jewish. In case of Adallah, we're Israeli, we're Palestinian, we're Arab. Give legitimacy to campaigns which single out Israel, calls for BDS, very often with anti-Semitic rhetoric. One of the last points that I want to conclude on is to the current campaign that seeks to completely delegitimize Israel. Not Israeli policies, not the post-1967 occupation and settlements and all of that. Israel is an apartheid state. This is from B'Tselem. This is, let's say, the flagship organization in the Israel Fund. And this is their opening shot to legitimize what has become a massive campaign to demonize Israel as an apartheid state. We all know an apartheid state has no right to exist. It's South Africa. It can't exist. If you label Israel as an apartheid state, you're violating NIF's own rules, but you're also demonizing Israel. And the language here, a regime of Jewish supremacy. Listen to the poison in this language. Listen to the way it can be used and has been used to justify violence. A regime of Jewish supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. This is apartheid. From the river to the sea is the standard Palestinian Free Palestine chant. You hear it all their demonstrations. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. This is the language that's been adopted and used, and in many ways legitimized by B'Tselem. One more point that I want to end with, and that is the role of the NIF network. Not just the NIF network, they have allies in what they call the Progressive Israel Network. But I think NIF is certainly the most important. And by the way, with a budget of 35 million, they are the largest single actor in all of this activity and all this called civil society NGO networking and industry outside of European governments. So the other groups are much smaller and have significantly less influence, and they're also connected in some ways, like Americans for Peace Now, Amenu, they're all very much linked to the same network. This is a part of a campaign that they led to, again, attack, delegitimize the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism. The IHRA working definition is the most effective and the only consensus tool around the world for opposing anti-Semitism. And here we have the NIF network being strongly involved in undermining it and pulling the rug out from its adoption. If you want to find out more information about, and we have a lot more on the New Israel Fund, how it works, who it funds, how it's funded, then take a look at our website at NGO Monitor. And there's a number of pages, and it leads you to other pages on the New Israel Fund. On this, I will end over time my press. Oh, I'm way over time. I apologize.
No,
and open up the questions.
Not at all. That's wonderful, Gerald. Thank you very much. We'll just ask you to unshare your screen. That's it. And just before we get to questions, I'll just mention to people that if you're listening on J-Air, this is a live simulcast of the Australian Jewish Association's Zoom event, which we have every Wednesday night. Our guest tonight is Professor Gerald Steinberg from the NGO Monitor, who is outlining the bad behaviour of some of the NGOs who do present themselves as supporting Israel. Just before questions, I'll hand over to David for 30 seconds to tell us what's coming up next week, and then we'll take some questions. I've got Michael and Anna, and I think Robert's got some questions too. David.
Okay, thank you, Alan, and thank you, Gerald, for a very interesting and informative presentation. So just very quickly, next week is our last event of the year. So we've got one of the top experts in Israel to give us an overview on some of the politics of 2021, the good, the bad and the ugly, with our friend Professor Ephraim Inbar, the president of the Jerusalem Institute of Security and Strategy and Security, and the lead into what we can expect in 2022. And finally, before you log off your computers tonight, if you are not doing these three things, please go to the AJA website, apply for membership if you're not yet a member, or make a contribution. You can donate via the website. Make sure you've joined the email list, which you can sign up on the website, and also like and follow the AJA Facebook page, where there is the news and views updated typically a few times a day.
Thanks, David. Okay, question time. So Michael, you were first, so please unmute yourself and ask your question. Michael Bird?
Hasn't got his hand up.
No, okay.
I found him.
Okay.
Gerald, it's Michael Bird speaking. The New Israel Fund, I've been following them for probably nearly 10 years. They boast that they've got a very big budget in Australia. The head is a former Orge's leader. New Israel Fund supporters argue that they support New Israel Fund because some of the social issues or social justice issues that they do, and obviously ignore the major damage that they do. They brought out Breaking the Silence to Australia to help vilify Israel last year. What are your thoughts when they argue that, oh, well, we support them because of the social justice issues, but obviously ignoring all the damage they're doing to Israel's image in Australia and elsewhere?
Michael, that's a conversation I've had with a lot of the Americans and also Canadians who supported NIF. And the answers that they give are very unsatisfactory, I guess, as you noted. I'll do that diplomatically and academically. Look, as I said, we're talking about 10% of the budget. That's a small amount, they say, but 10% of poison is still poison. And I think in many cases, my point that I make to them, and a few of them have left the organization and stopped their funding as a result, is that you as a contributor, as a donor, as a point of influence, someone who signs on to and is visibly affiliated with the NIF, you have a voice. You can say, it's not just I want my money to go to social causes. I don't want any of this to be affiliated with the NIF. I can't be part of this. I think that's what's missing here. Yes, the 90%, the social causes, and one can argue maybe it's only 80%, whatever. I can understand that. In Israel, Jews supporting social causes in Israel goes a long way back. But it doesn't justify the kind of vicious anti-Zionism that we see, and particularly that's why I use the apartheid campaign or breaking the silence for other organizations. So I think it's a matter of why aren't you speaking out and using your leverage as a donor in order to prevent the abuses that cause so much damage?
Yes, definitely. Anne, your turn. Please unmute yourself.
Yes, hello. Nice to hear you speak, Gerald. I've got two questions.
Can we just make it one, please, Anne? Because we are running out of time.
I'll make it one. Do the NGOs donate money or resources to different political parties during national elections throughout the world?
The organizations that we look at, to the extent that we can see the evidence, the answer is no. What they do, however, provide is a platform. So they don't give money in most cases. I don't know of any examples of that, but they provide a platform. And very often you'll see people who in Israeli politics who go from being the head of one of the NGOs to becoming a member of the Knesset and becoming not just a party activist, but very involved in leading one of these parties. So there's a lot of movement back and forth, particularly, as you wouldn't be surprised, on the left, where an NGO for a person, particularly also Israeli Arabs, will get their support, their funding, their development and the visibility from one of these NGOs like Adala, and then become a member of parliament because they're visible as a result of that. That's a more subtle process, but it is, and of course they also clearly affect the policy debates, but it's not the same thing as putting money into campaigns or parties. They're quite careful, at least in terms of the Israeli groups. Among the Palestinian groups, I should add that very often the heads of these NGOs will also be members of, they are members of political parties, and will often have very specific political roles. So that's quite different. And there the money just goes all over the place. There's no way of tracking what's used for the objectives.
Okay, we'll go to Anthony's iPad first, and then we'll take Robert with some written questions. Please unmute yourself.
Am I unmuted? Hi.
Yes.
I'm not Anthony, I'm the other half. Given that Israel faces this constant existential threat from Arabs and whatever, how do these Jewish people justify that what their activities are actually aiding and abetting this constant existential threat?
Look, I think from there, the way they explain it, some of this is psychological. I'm not a psychologist. I'm sure there are people in this audience who know more about this than I do. Some of it is about ego. I want to be important. I want to be able to, I'm going to oppose this Israeli government and show that I'm moral and I get my name in the papers, a lot of that. But their justification, they're more, I should say, maybe philosophical, moral justification. They say Israel's on the wrong path. That's the whole point about being an opposition government created after the election of 1977, where for the first time you have a government that's headed by Menachem Begin, by the Likud framework, which is not, I guess the right wing is probably the more accurate way to phrase it. And so they're still in opposition, and that's their justification. We oppose the occupation. Very often the catchword is we oppose the occupation is immoral, we can do whatever it's justified, whatever is we do, the means justify the ends, and they can live with that.
Robert, have you got any written questions that you'd like to ask on behalf of people?
Yeah, we'll just ask a couple. So thanks, Gerald, it's very informative. Just asking, what can we do to help? So in Australia, you said the government's not funding too many radical groups, but are there any we should be pointing out, anything we should be campaigning on?
Again, in terms of Australia, if I were talking to Europeans or even Americans now, I would say yes. In the case of Australia, there's a lot of caution. You have to be careful. I think it's called AusAid, needs to be watched. There are other groups that are out there that occasionally you'll get somebody who'll say, oh, other governments are doing this, let's put our money here. But they've been quite cautious, and I think that's still the case. I don't do UN type support, but things like supporting UNRWA and other organizations is also, it's part of the broader atmosphere that needs to be focused on. I think it's mainly I think one of the main issues from this perspective, from the perspective of the NGOs, I would focus less on the government in this case and more on the media. Taking the NIF organizations that function and the spokespeople, the whole machine that promotes the NIF agenda and getting them into the media, attacking the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, or promoting the apartheid libel against Israel, which gets into the media. That's something that I think people should and can take on, and especially when they'll quote an expert and the expert will happen to be someone from one of these organizations, which is almost always the case.
Do you think that the donors to the NIF, do you think they all know about what's going on? Because we had a collaboration here between a major national Jewish organization and the NIF. Do you think everyone's aware what they're up to?
As I said before, in many cases, I think the answer is no. I think that they donors, first of all, don't go into the details. They accept what the organization says it does. And in almost all of their donor material aimed at Jewish individuals, foundations, organizations, they talk about their social role. They don't talk about their political role. They don't talk about the element that they know will alienate many committed Jewish donors. And I think there the issue of trying to encourage the donors, the participants, the leaders to look at the details, I think telling them to abandon the NIF is probably in many cases too difficult. There's also a social bonding among donors, but to say to them, you can use your leverage to have these type of, I'll use the term again, poisonous anti-Israel campaigns removed from the NIF agenda. I think that's important. It would be a big fight because they're deeply ingrained. But again, it's a small amount of the total budget. And if it became important for NIF survival, I think they would do it.
Yes, Beryl and Brian, you're not on camera, but please unmute and ask your question.
I was surprised to see on your list that Germany was not a major contributor to NGOs, but yet is that because they give directly to the PA itself, or how does it work? We know that
Germany is one of the major contributors to Palestinian NGOs. I don't have the slide in front of me. We may have left it off on what you saw, but it's one of the major. But they do not directly contribute to many of the more radical Palestinian NGOs, the ones that are connected to the terrorist organizations. In most cases, their amounts are small. And the other point is Germany's the least transparent of European governments. So that's another aspect of the work that we do, is to try to push internally for the Germans to be more visible in who they support.
Yeah, thank you. Just one final one from me, Gerald. I mean, the European countries are all handing over the money hand over fist to these anti-Israel NGOs. And you come along and say, hang on a minute, do you really know what you're doing? What sort of a reaction do you get? And has it changed over the years?
It has changed over the years. The first reaction is automatically, we've looked at the evidence and what you're saying is incorrect. Sometimes they'll quote some fringe organization that will say NGO Monitor, they just make stuff up. They're just an ideological group. We are often labeled as being part of the Israeli government, which of course we're absolutely not. We were working across the board with all parties and all groups, except for some of the anti-Zionist ones. And then the Europeans start to see the detail. In one case, in the case of Netherlands, they recognized after members of parliament there raised our material that they had been funding one of these PFLP organizations, and their money was used to pay the salary of the person who's on trial for having been the leader of the cell that killed 17-year-old Rina Schneerb. So they froze the money. I think now what we're seeing is a process where the NGOs are fighting back. They have extensive allies. When you have this much money, you have to have a strong base in each country. They're fighting back, but I think we're slowly, gradually seeing Europeans turning off the taps for the most obvious examples of the terror NGO link. The propaganda groups will come next. That's harder to get them to see. But once you've started the process of reviewing all their NGO funding, which has never been done, then they begin to cut back, and that's what we're seeing.
And do you think that the aim of all of these NGOs is ultimately to replace Israel with some sort of binational state? Do you think that's really what's behind it all, or are they naive?
I think that's broader than that. I think in the Palestinians, their goal is to get rid of Israel completely. And let's remember the Palestinians are at least a third of this network, third in funding, third in influence, third in visibility. For the global groups like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, where there is deeply embedded hatred, anti-Semitism, removing Israel in some way or weakening Israel is the goal, certainly to push Israel back to the pre-1967 borders, but in many cases, Israel, for them, is an illegal, immoral entity. Any Jewish sovereignty is unacceptable because these are real diehard ideologues. I'm talking about Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and other groups. For the Israeli groups, I think many of the people there will say that they are in favor of two states based on the pre-1967, what they call borders, which never existed. But some of them are more radical and do say that Israel, and we saw that in the B'Tselem quote, that Israel as a Jewish state is immoral and has no right to exist. So you get a range, and I wouldn't characterize them all in the same box.
Yeah. Okay, well, we have run out of time. Gerald, I don't know whether you found the world of NGOs or that world found you, but your work has been invaluable to those of us interested in Israel advocacy and its centrality to the Jewish people. Thank you for doing it, and thank you for giving us such a well-produced insight into it today, and you deserve all the credit that comes your way. So on behalf of the AJA, I want to thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for the invitation, for taking the time. Thank you all.
Now, just mention your website again if people want to get more information.
Okay, it's NGO-Monitor.org.
Okay.
www.ngo-monitor.org.
Yeah.
If you look it up on Google, even if you misspell it, they'll point you in the right direction.
And in terms of funding, Gerald, are you always happy to accept funding from?
We are always happy to accept any support that we can get. We don't have Australian tax-exempt status, but we do have some supporters there, and any help that we can get is always appreciated. It's also, details are on our website.
Okay, thank you again, Gerald. Just before we go, if anybody wants some more Jewish themed radio, head over to 3ZZZ and listen to the L'chaim program with Morris Klein. That's on right now, FM 92.3 or 3ZZZ.com.au. That's all we have for tonight. Join us next week for our final program of the year. And of course, we're delighted to be joined by Ephraim Inbar, who is always a popular speaker. Don't forget, you can keep up to date with what AJA is talking about on our Facebook page. Please like it and share widely. Thank you again, Gerald. It was wonderful to have you. But for now, we wish everybody a very good evening and look forward to seeing you all next week as usual. So from me, it's bye for now. Good night, everyone.